Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the extraordinary lives and resilience of medieval peasants, ordinary people who managed to survive some of the coldest, harshest nights in history. From creative insulation techniques to collective sleeping arrangements, their endurance is a testament to human determination, resourcefulness, and grit. Before we begin, consider liking the video and subscribing, only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of content. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some ambient background noise, and let's ease into tonight's topic. When you picture medieval life, you might think of knights in armor, lavish banquets, or lively fairs. But for the average peasant, winter wasn't a season for celebration. It was a challenge to survive. It came back each year like a harsh instructor who didn't believe in giving second chances. Imagine living in a cramped hut made from mud and sticks, where the walls are so thin you can hear animals outside. There's no insulation, no real windows, just a hole stuffed with animal hide, and definitely no heating system. The temperature inside your home hovered only slightly above what it was outdoors. If it was freezing outside, it was just a touch less freezing indoors. Nights were especially harsh. Darkness blanketed everything, wind shrieked through gaps, and the fire barely managed to warm the person sitting closest. If you were on the far side of the room, you may as well have been outside, just with worse food. Warm clothing offered little protection. Peasants didn't have fur-lined coats or cozy blankets. You had rough woolen tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled a bit like goat, and the hope that layering would somehow keep you warm. Spoiler: it didn't help much. Forget thick quilts. Beds were often just sacks of straw or hay, maybe with a few old rushes. Bonus: they came with fleas. The cold wasn't merely uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Hypothermia, frostbite, and freezing to death were constant threats, especially for children and the elderly. Every morning you woke up, still breathing, was something of a quiet victory, perhaps worth celebrating with a slightly less frozen turnip. Surviving winter wasn't about comfort, it was about perseverance. You wore every piece of clothing you owned, huddled near animals for warmth, and prayed you didn't wake up with icicles on your eyebrows. And that was just the beginning. Think your apartment has a draft. Peasant homes made today's drafty apartments look like luxury hotels. Most medieval homes were built using a method politely called wattle and daub, interwoven sticks coated with a mix of mud, straw, and yes, animal dung. It wasn't meant to be disgusting. It was simply practical and readily available. These humble walls offered minimal resistance to winter winds. Every crack and gap welcomed the cold, which happily swept through the room, making sure you stayed thoroughly chilled. Warmth, rare. Privacy, non-existent. Character building, definitely. Roofs made from thatch might look charming today, but after months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally let in small animals. Windows, if they existed, were tiny and covered with animal hide or wood shutters. Glass was so costly that even wealthy landowners often had just one small pane. Peasants were lucky if the wind didn't tear the hide off mid-storm. Floors were compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed, water seeped in from below, making it feel like you were trudging through a swamp, indoors. Cold came from every direction, above, below, and all around. It was an all-out assault on your body heat, but peasants didn't sit around complaining. They stuffed moss into cracks, plugged gaps with old cloth, and relied on the warmth of each other. Creativity, determination, and the occasional layer of sheep grease helped them endure nights that could have easily ended in disaster. If your walls were crumbling and your best defense involved goat hair and mud, at least you could laugh, assuming your teeth weren't chattering too hard. As if freezing air weren't enough, peasants also contended with the cold rising from below. Floors weren't really floors, just flattened earth. Maybe, if someone had the time or straw to spare, a few bundles were tossed down to soften the blow. But make no mistake, you were one thin layer away from sleeping directly on frozen dirt, and that dirt wasn't passive. Cold seeped from the ground, through your straw bedding and straight into your bones. Drop something on the floor overnight. Congratulations, it was now part of the permafrost. To fight back, peasants laid thick straw mats or rushes on the floor. If you had the means, or could borrow from a neighbor's field, you might insulate the ground a bit. But straw flattened quickly, grew moldy, and offered little long-term relief. Some households used layers of dried rushes, tossing fresh ones on top without clearing out the old. Over time, this created a damp, pest-infested layer that was more compost pile than carpet. Beds didn't help much either. Most were simple wooden frames, filled with straw or hay. No soft mattresses here, just shifting, crunchy layers that barely dulled the chill from below. Sleeping wasn't restful. It was a constant effort to stay warm and avoid freezing one side of your body. Medieval peasants didn't conquer the cold, they tolerated it. A decent night's sleep wasn't about dreams or comfort, it meant waking up with all your fingers and toes intact. And if you did, you were already ahead of the curve. If there was one reliable ally during the winter months, it was the hearth. Not the chimneyed fireplaces of modern homes, but a basic fire pit, often just stones, ash, and smouldering wood. Yet it was the heart of the home. These homes rarely had chimneys. Smoke found its own way out, through holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or directly into your lungs. Not great for your health, but surprisingly effective at fumigating the fleas. Who needs pest control when your house doubles as a smokehouse? The hearth was more than heat. It was the kitchen, the light source, and the main gathering place. Families sat around it talking, telling stories, or simply staring into the flames, because there wasn't much else to do once the sun went down. Keeping the fire going was essential. Letting it die out overnight wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an invitation for the cold to take over. Reigniting a fire wasn't simple either. It took flint, steel, dry kindling, and patience, plus maybe a few prayers. Everyone had a role, stoking the fire, adding peat, or guarding the embers. It was a constant struggle between human effort and the freezing air that threatened to snuff out your only source of warmth. The hearth couldn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was nearly impossible. In a bleak, frozen world, that small, smoky fire was more than just heat. It was a symbol of hope. And if there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting that fire go out in the night. Without it, the cold crept in faster than a tax collector after harvest. In the depths of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just a hassle. It could be a matter of life and death. There were no matches, and lighters weren't even imagined yet. Rekindling a flame meant striking flint and steel together, hoping for a single precious spark, and then nurturing it carefully with whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned through. Now picture trying this in the freezing darkness, half asleep with numb fingers. Add a distant wolf howling for good measure. Understandably, peasants found smarter ways. They banked the fire, not with coins, but by burying the embers under a mound of ash before bed. That ash acted as insulation, preserving just enough heat in the coals to relight a fire by morning. Done correctly, it meant you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the ash pile, toss on fresh wood, and enjoy a fire without risking frostbite. Done poorly, you woke up to cold air and colder tempers. Firebanking was a vital skill, passed down like a treasured family recipe. Everyone had their own method. Some swore by dry ash, others added a hint of moisture. Some packed embers tightly, others let them breathe. You could start a full-blown medieval debate just by suggesting a new firebanking trick. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue, but with higher stakes. Even so, firebanking wasn't foolproof. A sudden gust of wind could blow through a crack and extinguish the embers. A clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. It happened. That's why some families took shifts during the night to check on the coals, the medieval equivalent of sneaking over to adjust the thermostat. Ultimately, firebanking wasn't about dominating nature. It was about gaining a few more precious hours of warmth. If you woke to a single glowing ember, that was a small but meaningful victory, enough to face another cold day. Back then, the more the merrier wasn't just a party phrase, it was a survival strategy. When fires burned low and icy winds crept through every gap, people relied on each other for warmth. That meant sleeping cheek to cheek with family, neighbors, livestock, and sometimes even a puzzled goose. Forget personal space. In harsh winters, privacy didn't exist. Comfort wasn't the goal. Avoiding frostbite was. Whole households huddled in the warmest corner of their homes, wrapped in whatever cloth scraps were left. The result? A cramped, snoring human lasagna. Young. Children nestled between parents, grandparents curled up on the outside, and if Cousin Ethel dropped by unannounced, well, there was always room for one more. The lucky ones slept in the middle, warmed on all sides. The unlucky ones were on the edge, essentially beside the door of a meat locker, and if you moved too much, to outsiders it might have looked and smelled like medieval peasants had abandoned hygiene altogether. But that grimy tunic had a purpose. Insulation. It kept them from freezing to death. It wasn't stylish, but neither was frostbite. And when everyone around you smelled the same, no one noticed. Over time, people became so used to the odors that they barely registered them. In that world, layers of filth weren't failure. They were both fashion and function. If your clothes were thick with grease by February, you were surviving just fine. Forget plush beds and cozy quilts. Winter sleeping arrangements for peasants were far more basic. Rustic is putting it nicely. Beds, if you had one, were wooden frames topped with sacks filled with straw, hay, or old rushes. No memory foam, no orthopedic design, just a lumpy, scratchy pile that smelled faintly of farm animals and bad choices. Every movement came with the sound of crinkling straw or the occasional stab from a stiff stalk. Some peasants didn't even have a bed frame. They simply threw straw on the dirt floor. Today, someone might rebrand this as earth-connected sleeping. Back then, it was just survival. These straw beds weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, they flattened, got moldy, attracted insects, and needed replacing. If you were diligent, you changed the straw a few times a year, or when it started moving on its own. Rushes were a popular floor covering too. Long grasses were spread across the ground, sometimes mixed with herbs like rosemary or lavender to help mask everyday smells. Fresh rushes might have smelled nice for a day. After that, they merged with the mud, scraps, and whatever else ended up indoors. And then there were the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other pests thrived in straw just as much as people did. If you woke up scratching more than sleeping, you were having a genuinely medieval experience. Despite all that, these humble beds were life-saving. They added insulation from the frozen ground. Sleeping close together generated shared warmth. This was medieval heating at its most practical. So next time you ease into a comfortable mattress, remember, somewhere in history a medieval peasant is smirking, missing a few teeth and thinking, must be nice. When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and determination, winter winds don't just chill, they attack. Medieval peasants had to fight the cold, not only outdoors, but also inside their own homes, armed only with whatever they could find to block the drafts. And there were plenty of drafts. Mud crumbled, wood warped, and thatched roofs sagged. Cold. Air snuck in like an uninvited guest. Insulating your home became a daily chore. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, cloth scraps, dry grass, even animal hair. If it could plug a hole, it got used. Some households went a step further and smeared extra layers of mud and dung over their outer walls each winter. Imagine standing outside in freezing temperatures, smearing manure on your house, telling yourself, "This is fine, this is luxury," because in their reality it was. Roof leaks were another problem. Thatched roofing was affordable but far from waterproof, especially after a few winters. Peasants patched holes with whatever was available: cloth, reeds, or even turf pulled from nearby fields. Eventually, houses started looking like patchwork projects abandoned halfway through. If your home had a door or window, you were lucky. But even then, they were usually just planks nailed in place. Window openings were covered with animal hides or cloth soaked in fat. This kept the drafts out and added a subtle, meaty smell to the home. Every night became a contest between human creativity and bitter cold. One moment you were warm, the next, a cold breeze found the gap you missed. Yet, through persistence, inventiveness, and an unwillingness to accept half frozen as normal, medieval peasants made it through each winter, one patch, one handful of straw at a time. When it's too cold to sleep, peasants didn't pretend everyone could rest at once. They developed a practical system, sleeping in shifts. It wasn't a formal operation with whistles and checklists. It was driven by necessity. Part of the household stayed awake to tend the fire and fix any new drafts. The rest tried to sleep, under thin blankets and scratchy straw, grabbing what rest they could. Fires required constant attention. If they died down, relighting them wasn't easy. So someone was always assigned to ember duty. No one wanted to leave their warm spot, so families rotated turns. You'd sleep for a few hours, then get nudged awake to keep the fire alive, all while trying not to trip over livestock. There were no perks, no nightlights, no snacks, no snooze buttons, just tired bodies and grudging responsibility. Children were expected to help as soon as they could hold a stick. Grandparents often stayed by the fire longer, not just because of experience, but because standing up and lying back down was a serious effort. Even when it was your turn to sleep, it wasn't peaceful. People moved, animals stirred, wind howled, and siblings rolled into you by accident. Yet, somehow, the system worked. Someone was always there to keep the fire going, and thanks to that ember watch, the household stayed warm enough to survive. So next time you're annoyed about adjusting the thermostat or letting the dog out, remember a medieval peasant staring into a smoldering fire at 3 a.m., wondering if warm toes were worth the effort. When cold air can kill you, even breathing becomes a survival skill. Peasants learned to adapt their breathing just to make it through the night. The problem: open-mouth breathing dragged in freezing air straight into the lungs. In a world without antibiotics, pneumonia could be deadly, so they practiced what you might call survival breathing. Small, slow inhales, always through the nose. The goal was to warm the air slightly before it reached the lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into a fever. If you took a deep breath of icy air, congratulations. You were signing up for a week of painful coughing, with no doctor in sight. Treatment came in the form of hot, onion tea and determined prayers from grandma. Some even slept with cloaks or cloth pulled over their faces, creating a sort of breath warmer. Sure, it left your mouth damp by morning, but that beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these habits early. Parents scolded them for panting indoors. Between scratchy clothes, strict breathing rules, and sleeping next to animals, winters in medieval childhood were a whole different kind of tough. At night, buried under cloaks and nestled beside a cow, breathing became a practiced art, slow, steady, and silent. Like a harsh version of a wellness retreat, except with more frostbite and fewer calming mantras. In the long fight against winter, it wasn't the bold strategies that made the biggest difference. It was the small, careful breaths that helped peasants endure each night. To keep the cold at bay, Medieval peasants didn't reach for another scratchy wool cloak. They reached for a heavy, hearty meal before bed. Calories equaled warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more internal heat it produced. This was basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a dense meal, generate body heat, and maybe, just maybe, make it through the night without freezing solid. So what did they eat to fuel this survival strategy? Think thick rustic stews packed with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains were vital too. Oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense slices of rye bread. If luck was on your side, say after a feast day or a recent slaughter, you might even enjoy a bit of salted pork or dried sausage added to the pot. This wasn't comfort food in any modern sense. No presentation, no garnishes, just a heavy brown meal meant to sit like a warm brick in your gut, slowly releasing heat through the night. It wasn't about volume alone, it was about choosing foods that digested slowly. Fatty foods were prized not only for their energy, but because they burned more gradually than lean meats. A full belly of stew, bread, and lard was the height of winter luxury. Parents made sure even the fussiest children ate up. No one cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You either ate them or you shivered all night missing them. It was tough love, medieval style. Of course, eating that much before bed had its downsides, like bizarre, vivid dreams brought on by a stomach battling a field's worth of vegetables. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Because for medieval peasants, survival, not style, was the ultimate goal. And if that meant falling asleep, bloated, lying next to a steaming cow, then so be it. Before electric blankets and fancy mattresses, medieval, people had to get creative to stay warm. Enter two unsung heroes of winter survival, the haybox and the heated stone. The haybox was as rustic as it sounds, but surprisingly effective. A wooden box lined with thick hay could hold heat for hours. Stew or porridge, once cooked, was tucked inside to stay warm without needing to rekindle the fire. In essence, it was a medieval slow cooker, but they didn't stop with food. If hay could hold the heat of a stew pot, it could hold the warmth of something even better, rocks. Before bedtime, someone, usually the least lucky family member, would toss a flat stone into the heart of the hearth. After it was thoroughly heated, but not molten, it was pulled out with old tongs or sticks, wrapped in cloth, and placed in a clay pot or bundled in rags. This makeshift heating pad was then slipped into the bed, often under the hay mattress, or at the foot of the bed. There were risks, of course. Wrap it poorly and you risked a scorched bed, or worse. Drop it on your foot and you had a winter injury that had nothing to do with slipping on ice. But when it worked, the heat could last for hours. It wasn't fancy, but if a neighbor's chimney stopped smoking, someone noticed. Not just because they owed you a chicken, though that helped, but because the whole village relied on mutual vigilance. Communities often had informal winter watchers, usually the elderly or children, who kept an eye on who was coughing too much, who hadn't been to market, or whose home looked worryingly quiet. If a fire went out, it was serious. A good neighbor would rush over with a wrapped coal, or open their door, to shelter a freezing family. Yes, it meant cramming into already tight quarters, but it beat the alternative. During harsh winters, villages sometimes pooled their last food supplies, salted meat, dried veggies, grains. It was grim, but shared meals meant shared survival. Even children took part, fetching firewood, delivering embers, running messages. No one was too small to help. Sure, villages had their feuds over land, goats, or borrowed pots, but when winter came, grudges often paused. Even rivals were worth saving, because next time it could be you needing rescue. In the icy depths of winter, the village functioned as one determined, chaotic, resilient family. And in addition to food, fire, and hay, medieval peasants turned to something just as crucial: faith. When the wind howled and embers faded, they prayed. A lot. Religion wasn't reserved for Sunday. It was part of daily survival. Families knelt before bed, praying for warmth, safety, and another morning. Saints weren't just distant holy figures, they were protectors. Saint Blaise was called upon for throat illnesses, not a small concern when a breath of cold air could bring deadly sickness. Saint Nicholas wasn't just the gift-giver of legend, he was asked to guard homes from misfortune. Superstitions also shaped bedtime rituals. Some families sprinkled holy water near the hearth or marked doors with blessed chalk after feast days, hoping to guard against spirits or even just cold drafts. Special candles, sometimes blessed by the priest or the most devout elder, were kept burning through the night, small flickers against the dark, icy unknown, and no winter prayer was complete without a plea or two. Lord, if you just get us through the night, I promise to be nicer to the neighbor who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't abstract comfort, it was urgent. Peasants weren't asking for riches, just a little warmth, a bit of food, and another day closer to spring. Their hope was raw, whispered into the rafters, carried on shallow breaths, and tucked beneath scratchy blankets. But even with all the cleverness, prayers, and communal effort, sometimes winter still won. When it did, it didn't just take a few, it took many. Families, entire villages, vanished under snow and silence. Some winters were particularly cruel, like the Great Famine Winter of 1315. Unrelenting rain ruined crops, livestock perished, and the cold ground people down. Hunger reached such desperation that people chewed bark, boiled leather, and, at their lowest, turned on each other. When a family's fire went out for good, it was often the end. Neighbors sometimes discovered entire households frozen in place come spring, still huddled together. Survival in medieval winter was never guaranteed. But through ingenuity, unity, and faith, many made it through. One fire, one prayer, one shivering breath at a time. In each other's frozen grasp, they huddled, sharing the last bits of warmth until the end. Entire homes could collapse under thick snow or relentless ice storms. A roof giving way in the middle of a bitter night wasn't just disastrous, it was often deadly. Struggling through waist-deep snow in search of help from neighbors offered no certainty, especially if those neighbors were already overwhelmed. Cold welcomed disease. Starvation weakened the body, while cramped, smoky homes became breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other fatal infections. A simple December cough could easily lead to a funeral by January. Then came frostbite, a quiet, creeping horror. Fingers, toes, even ears blackened and died, still attached to their owners. Some villagers made it through winter, but not without sacrifice. Missing limbs were grim reminders of their survival. I lived, they might say, but winter took a part of me. What lingers most isn't just the death, but how routine it became. People understood that every winter would take someone. Death wasn't shocking, it was simply a neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, awaiting its turn. Yet, despite the misery, medieval peasants carried on. They grieved, but they fought to live. As long as a single ember remained in the hearth, as long as one breath floated in the frozen air, they pressed forward. It's easy to look back and see only their suffering. Cracked hands, frostbitten feet, smoke-filled rooms. But beneath the struggle lies something more enduring, sheer, relentless resilience. They had no central heat, no insulated coats, no plush mattresses. They didn't even have the comfort of believing they'd live to see spring. What they did have, what they passed on, was a blueprint for survival. Every straw-stuffed mattress, every carefully tended fire, every moss-packed wall gap showed human ingenuity in the face of impossible odds. They didn't surrender, they adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, and from the bitter teachings of each brutal season. Their communities weren't just built on land, they were founded on shared endurance. They watched over the sick, pooled food when it ran low, and believed that helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone might return the favor tomorrow. No one survived winter alone. Even their faith was a form of perseverance. They wove prayers into daily life, not just out of fear, but from stubborn hope. Hope that tomorrow would be a little warmer, a little lighter, that after 100 frozen nights, spring would return and life would once again push through the ice. And somehow, it always did. Because of their sacrifices and their small, quiet victories, surviving just one more storm, one more bitter night, future generations thrived. Inch by frozen inch, they moved humanity forward. They endured winters their ancestors couldn't have imagined surviving until warmth and comfort became expected instead of distant dreams. Their blood, sweat, and hard-won knowledge are invisibly stitched into our lives. Every soft blanket, every warm home, every quiet evening spent sipping tea beneath glowing lights, they all trace back to countless medieval peasants who refused to be broken by the cold. So next time the wind howls outside, your double-glazed window, spare a thought for them, the nameless, fearless souls who turned raw survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one fierce heartbeat at a time. Anne Boleyn didn't enter the world crowned or commanding armies. She was born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, to Thomas Boleyn, a driven diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with powerful connections. In Tudor society, her birth made little noise. Yet from these quiet beginnings, a story was already beginning, one that would shape England's future. Anne wasn't set apart by riches, but by her sharp mind. Bright, confident, and charismatic, her family saw her potential and sent her to the continent for education. A rare privilege. She first served Margaret of Austria at the dazzling court in the Netherlands. There, she learned diplomacy, courtly manners, and the subtleties of European power. But it was in France that Anne truly came into her own. She spent years in the cultured courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, mastering the art of influence, charm, and sophisticated conversation. While other young women focused on embroidery, Anne honed her wit, intrigue, and presence. She could command attention without even appearing to try. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne had become something rare, a woman, as refined as any continental courtier, yet deeply rooted in English ambition. Even her admirers acknowledged she wasn't traditionally beautiful, but she was striking. Her dark, intelligent eyes, quick, musical voice, and deliberate movements conveyed purpose under layers of elegance. Anne didn't just enter a room, she changed its atmosphere. In a world where a woman's path was often limited by birth or marriage, she refused to fade into the background. She had seen how charm and intellect could influence power, and she intended to use those tools at home. Still young and largely untested, Anne was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She had become a player in a larger game, one that would soon shake the very throne. When Anne returned to court, she was unlike anyone the nobility had known. Among pale, obedient English roses, she was a storm, bold, unpredictable, unforgettable. Her dark features and sharp mind stood in stark contrast to the quiet ladies-in-waiting who surrounded Queen Catherine of Aragon. Anne took her place as a maid of honor to the Queen. But even in the Queen's shadow, she stood out. She danced gracefully, spoke French fluently, and carried herself with a confidence few women dared show. Men noticed, women whispered. The court buzzed about Anne Boleyn. It wasn't long before she caught the eye of the most dangerous man of all, the king, Henry. Fate was no stranger to flirtation. His court thrived on secret affairs and whispered promises. But Anne was different. She didn't swoon at his praise or fall into his arms like others. She resisted. She teased. She challenged. Henry, used to instant admiration, was enthralled. The more she kept him at a distance, the more he desired her. Their letters brimmed with passion, frustration, longing. He offered her the role of royal mistress, a powerful, if unofficial, position. Anne said no, she would not be another fleeting conquest. If Henry wanted her, he would have to marry her. It was a shocking demand. The king was already married. Queen Catherine was deeply respi. By June, Anne was publicly crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the pinnacle of her life. But the atmosphere in London was far from entirely festive. The people watched with mixed emotions. Some cheered, while others quietly whispered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many were unsure whether this new queen, with her French ways and bold personality, would bring fortune or misfortune. Anne entered her queenship not with adoration, but like a storm. Unlike Catherine, who represented traditional English values like humility and devotion, Anne was striking, bold, and politically sharp. She wore vivid colors, commanded attention, with her quick mind, and quickly made powerful enemies. Her position, though seemingly secure, was dangerously fragile. Everything depended on one thing, giving Henry a male heir. Anne understood this as clearly as anyone. She was no longer just Henry's lover. She was the hope of a dynasty. Early in her pregnancy, Anne and Henry were thrilled, convinced the baby would be a boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To her credit, Anne hid her disappointment and remained optimistic, saying the next child would surely be a son. Henry, however, was less composed. His adoring gaze began to shift, with doubt. Still, for a time, Anne flourished. She transformed the English court in her own image, raising her family's status to unprecedented levels. She became the first English queen to be crowned with sacred oil, a right previously reserved for kings. Her influence spread far. Foreign diplomats courted her favor, and alliances shifted to remain in her good graces. Henry, once obedient to Rome, now moved to separate England from the Pope's control, establishing the Church of England, with himself at the helm, all to secure Anne's crown. Yet even as she triumphed, threats loomed. Friends whispered behind closed doors, rivals watched and waited. Henry, restless and changeable, was already growing distant from the dazzling woman who had reshaped his realm. Anne had won the crown, but keeping it would require more than charm or ambition. It would take everything. She had risen higher than nearly any woman of her age, but the higher the ascent, the harder the fall. From the moment she was crowned, the cracks began to show. At the core of Anne's struggles was the pressure to bear a son. Her daughter Elizabeth, healthy and bright, was not the male heir Henry so desperately wanted, and time was slipping away. Anne experienced several pregnancies in quick succession, each ending in miscarriage. The physical toll weakened her. The emotional pain left her battered. With each lost child, her foundation eroded. Henry, once deeply passionate, began to withdraw. His disappointment created distance. Anne, never one to quietly accept defeat, argued and demanded fighting to maintain her place. But Henry, who valued obedience as much as beauty, grew weary of her defiance. Outside their chambers, enemies gathered. Many nobles who had tolerated Anne's rise with clenched jaws now actively plotted her fall. Catherine of Aragon's supporters never forgave Anne, blaming her for the break with Rome and the harsh changes that followed. Among the public she was scorned, labelled a seductress, blamed for the turmoil, and then came Jane Seymour. Quiet, submissive, everything Anne was not. Jane caught Henry's wandering eye just as Anne's influence was fading. Where Anne had captivated him with brilliance and resistance, Jane offered gentle compliance. It was a dangerous contrast. Anne, perceptive as ever, noticed the shift. She tried to win Henry back with affection, reassurances of future sons, and pleas for patience. But Henry, ever fickle, had begun to picture life without her, the very woman for whom he had upended a kingdom. Her political opponents, including Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, sensed the turning tide. They began orchestrating her destruction, quietly building a case through whispers, rumors, and alleged witnesses. Anne had achieved the crown through ambition and daring. But in the harsh, changing climate of Henry's court, past victories meant little. What mattered now was power, and Anne's enemies were sharpening their blades. They did not come with swords or armies. They came with secrets, insinuations, and carefully crafted lies. In the private corners of court, betrayal brewed, quiet, deliberate, and lethal. Thomas Cromwell, once her strongest ally in the Reformation, had turned against her. Their bond had been based on mutual goals, but now their visions clashed. Anne pushed for reforms to benefit the poor and reduce noble excess. Cromwell wanted stability and favour with the king. Anne's boldness made her a threat, and Henry's. Love had soured into frustration, suspicion, and cold distance. Anne, once surrounded by supporters, now stood mostly alone. Even her famed charm had become grating to a court hungry for a softer, more obedient queen. Jane Seymour, silent and strategic, waited in the background, the perfect alternative to Anne's waning flame. Cromwell made the first move. He knew Henry was restless and unwilling to suffer another public divorce. Cromwell offered a cleaner option: disgrace. The accusations were shocking: adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king. Anne, the proud and brilliant queen, was portrayed as a traitor, a seductress, a danger to the very monarchy she once reshaped. Cromwell extracted confessions under torture, twisted innocent courtly interactions into damning evidence. Several men were arrested, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were inconsistent, riddled with contradictions. But in Henry's court, truth was malleable, whatever the king needed it to be. Sensing her doom, Anne fought back. She appealed to Henry's memory and the love they once shared. But it was in vain. The man who once defied the world for her now avoided her gaze. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the gate closed behind her, she understood the truth. She was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner in the very game she had once mastered. In the Tower's great hall, Anne stood before a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their rank and fortune to her ascent. Now they sat in judgment, prepared to erase her from history. The accusations were severe: adultery with several men, including her brother, high treason, and plotting against the king. In another time, such charges against a queen would have been unthinkable, but now it was theatre, carefully staged to give Henry what he wanted. Anne defended herself with the same brilliance that once won Henry's heart. She denied every accusation calmly, confidently, and with intelligence. She reminded them she had been anointed queen, chosen by God, and loyal to the crown. She spoke of her sacrifices, her love, her duty. But it changed nothing. The outcome was predetermined. The trial was a performance for the court and for the nation. Witnesses, many coerced or bribed, gave damning testimonies. Their stories often contradicted one another, and the evidence was flimsy at best. But truth no longer mattered. Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the other men were sentenced to death as well. Anne would be executed by beheading, a more merciful punishment than the usual hanging, drawing, and quartering. Even as the sentence was read, Anne did not collapse. She stood tall, pale but composed. She declared she was ready to die and prayed that God would show mercy on her soul. As she left the courtroom, the court breathed a collective sigh of relief. The storm, brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable, was nearly over. Yet they misunderstood. They weren't erasing Anne Boleyn. They were making her a legend of betrayal, tragedy, and memory. Anne returned to the Tower of London not as a reigning, a queen, but as a condemned prisoner. Even so, she refused to fall apart. In the cold, echoing corridors, she prepared for death. She spent long hours in prayer, kneeling on stone floors, hands clasped, voice steady. She confessed no crimes because she believed herself innocent. She said she did not fear death, only hoped it would bring peace to England and perhaps grace to her young daughter Elizabeth. Her remaining ladies-in-waiting cried in secret. Anne comforted them instead of the other way around. She joked darkly that she would be remembered as the queen who lost her head, that gallows humour was part of what made her unforgettable. Meanwhile, Henry showed no mercy. He had already turned to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date was set, he began planning his next marriage. For Anne, this final betrayal by the man who once changed the world for her was likely the cruelest of all. On May 18th, 1536, she was told she would die the following morning. She barely slept. She spent her final hours in prayer, asking God to forgive those who wronged her, and perhaps to forgive her own ambition and pride. Henry, in a small gesture of royal consideration, arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution, a cleaner, quicker death than the axe. Perhaps it was for his conscience more than for Anne. At dawn, Anne dressed with care. She wore a grey damask gown trimmed in fur with a crimson underdress. They were colours of dignity and sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair, preparing to meet her fate, and with steady hands she tucked her hair beneath a plain cap, ready to face the blade. As the morning mist curled around the cold stones of the Tower courtyard, Anne Boleyn, Queen, Mother, Survivor, stepped forward. There were no tears, no pleas, only a final, composed gesture in the face of history's harsh verdict. Her death was imminent, but her story was far from over. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold erected within the walls of the Tower of London. A small, solemn crowd had gathered, guards, courtiers, a few chosen witnesses, all silent as if even the air held its breath. Anne stood to everything, because the price of tea wasn't the issue, the principle was. The Tea Act kept the tax in place. Buying it, even at a discount, meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them without representation. For many, that was a line they would not cross. News of the Tea Act spread rapidly. Colonial merchants feared for their businesses. Patriots recognized the message. The Crown still believed it had unchecked authority. In Boston, still reeling from the massacre and economic hardship, resistance surged. Accepting the tea would be surrender. Rejecting it became a point of honor, a test of loyalty to the cause. Public meetings grew larger. Newspaper editorials burned with protest. The Sons of Liberty, led by figures like Samuel Adams, pledged that East India Company tea would not be unloaded, sold, or consumed. Across the colonies, resistance spread. In port cities from New York to Charleston, ships carrying tea were turned away. The message was simple: we will not be bought. But Boston's case played out differently. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, arrived and anchored in the harbor. The standoff began. Officials demanded the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused. Tension mounted with each passing day. Boston braced itself. Taverns and churches echoed with heated debate. The Sons of Liberty moved quickly, organizing boycotts, printing warnings, rallying the city. The Old South Meeting House became the hub of resistance. Thousands packed into the wooden hall, each gathering, each vote, chipped away at British authority. Time was running out. British law required imported goods, like tea, to be unloaded within 20 days, or the cargo would be seized and taxes enforced by force. The Sons of Liberty knew that once the tax was paid, even under protest, their position would collapse. This had become more than a tax dispute. It was a question of whether the colonies would accept being ruled without representation. Governor Thomas Hutchinson stood firm. He refused to allow the tea ships to leave without unloading. To him, upholding the law mattered more than appeasing a mob. Backing down would hand power to rebellion. All of Boston watched the drama unfold. Every citizen sensed that a pivotal moment was near. The atmosphere was electric, like the stillness before a storm. One spark would change everything. Quietly, among the crowded streets, a plan began to form. December 16th, 1773, dawned cold and grey over Boston, a city poised on the edge of history. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea-ships had sat idle in the harbour. Now the final deadline had arrived. Under British law, the tea had to be unloaded and taxed. If not, customs officials would seize it and military force could follow. Everyone understood the stakes. If the tea was brought ashore, the colony's argument for rights and liberty would be irreparably weakened. That morning, thousands gathered at the old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Some had travelled for miles through icy terrain to attend. The hall overflowed. Crowds spilled into the streets, straining to catch a word of the speeches inside. Samuel Adams, the steadfast voice of resistance, presided. One speaker after another denounced the Tea Act, urged action, and condemned tyranny. Yet uncertainty lingered. How could they stop the tea without starting a war? By afternoon, messengers arrived with news. Governor Hutchinson had refused to allow the ships to leave. The tea would be seized, the tax enforced. The king's law would be upheld, regardless of public outrage. Inside the meeting house, tension rose. The walls echoed with anger. And then Samuel Adams stood and delivered a simple, decisive line. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. Everyone understood what it meant. There would be no more speeches, no more delays. Outside, a war whoop pierced the air. The signal had been given. Men sprang into action, disguising themselves in soot-streaked faces and cloaks, mimicking Mohawk attire. A protest was about to become a revolution. The men weren't trying to deceive anyone. It wasn't about disguise, but about creating a symbol, a message impossible to misinterpret. The deadline had passed, and Boston would respond not with diplomacy, but with bold defiance. As night fell on December 16th, 1773, the quiet streets of Boston stirred. Figures emerged in the dim light, ordinary townsmen cloaked in coarse blankets, faces darkened with soot, some wearing feathers. They weren't pretending to be actual Mohawks. The appearance was symbolic, a shedding of old identities, a declaration of something fierce and new. In silent groups, they made their way to Griffin's wharf, where 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay anchored. The harbour beneath them churned, icy and sharp with winter's bite. There was no shouting, no drunken uproar. This wasn't a riot. It was a calculated mission, carried out with calm, determined precision. Armed with hatchets and clubs, the disguised colonists boarded the ships, quickly overtaking the few crew members still on board. The sailors weren't harmed, merely moved aside, forced to watch in silence as the work began. With practiced swings, men smashed open wooden tea chests, releasing the pungent aroma of fresh leaves into the cold night. Others hauled crates to the rails, tossing them into the harbour, where they landed with heavy, echoing splashes. Chest after chest, 342 in total, was destroyed, until the harbour waters swirled black with thousands of pounds of tea. Spectators lined the wharf, watching silently. Nearby, British guards didn't interfere. Whether frozen by confusion, sympathy, or fear of violence remains uncertain. Some reports suggest even loyalists sensed that a shift had occurred, one that couldn't be undone. What stood out was the discipline. Nothing was stolen. The ships weren't looted for goods. Only the tea, the most visible symbol of British control, was destroyed. In a town plagued by hunger and hardship, the temptation to ransack would have been understandable. But they resisted. By the end, the harbour looked like a giant cauldron, full of broken crates and soaked tea leaves. The scent of seawater mixed with the sharp tang of tea lingered in the air, a strange, bitter perfume. And just as quietly as they had come, the men vanished, slipping into Boston's alleys and darkened streets, leaving no names, no leaders, no claims of glory, only the unmistakable trace of rebellion. As the last fragments of tea bobbed in the cold water, Boston stood still, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party wasn't chaos or a drunken spree. It was something rare, an act of measured defiance under cover of night. The harbour had become an enormous teapot. Mats of East India Company tea floated on the surface, staining it black. A few colonists, driven by curiosity, tried scooping some soaked tea from the water, only to be sternly warned off by the Sons of Liberty. Nothing was to be salvaged. No, and would benefit. This act was about principle, nothing more. By morning, the salty smell of tea still hung in the air. Word spread quickly through gossip, handwritten letters and printed broadsheets. By midday, everyone, from apprentices to merchants, had heard what happened, and opinions quickly divided. Among patriots, there was pride. Deep, fiery pride. That everyday people had stood up to the world's strongest empire and struck a blow for freedom. Among loyalists and moderates, there was alarm. To them, destroying property in protest was reckless. Had the colonies gone too far? Had they passed a point of no return? Governor Thomas Hutchinson raged from his mansion, furious not only at the loss of royal property, but at what it represented. If the king's authority could be challenged so boldly in Boston, what was stopping other cities from doing the same? British officials were stunned. They'd expected protests, maybe even riots like those seen during the Stamp Act crisis, but not this. Not organized, disciplined resistance carried out so thoroughly, so calmly, and with no collateral damage. The captains of the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver could do nothing but watch as their cargo sank beneath the waves. The official records tallied the damage at over $10,000, a vast sum. But the true loss wasn't in money or tea. It was in trust, in the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled with consent. The night the tea sank, something far more powerful rose in its place. A shared realization that peaceful protest was no longer enough. A reckoning was approaching, and Boston was ready. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, the response was swift and furious. British officials saw it not as protest but open rebellion, a direct challenge to royal authority that couldn't be ignored. King George III, upon hearing the news, was said to have grown cold with rage. Parliament, already fed up with colonial unrest, erupted in outrage. They demanded harsh punishment, not just for Boston, but as a message to all the colonies. Their answer came quickly, a series of punishing laws soon nicknamed the Intolerable Acts. The first blow came with the Boston Port Act, which shut down the harbour, Boston's economic lifeline, until the destroyed tea was repaid and royal control restored. Trade halted, supplies vanished. The bustling city grew quiet, the docks fell silent, but the measures didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the colony's self-rule, placing it firmly under the control of royal officials. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, reinforcing the message that they were above colonial law. To enforce this grip, British troops were stationed throughout Boston, quartered in private homes, their presence a daily reminder that resistance would not be tolerated. But instead of frightening the other colonies, Parliament's crackdown had the opposite effect. Boston's suffering stirred outrage and solidarity. Wagon load. The Intolerable Acts were meant to intimidate, to warn. Instead, they made Boston a martyr, a rallying cry from Georgia to New Hampshire. Colonists now understood their fates were tied. Resistance wasn't just about tea. It was about identity, survival, freedom. By spring of 1775, tensions boiled over. Outside Boston, in the villages of Lexington and Concord, British troops marched to seize colonial weapons. Instead, they found armed farmers, ready to defend their rights. The first shots of the American Revolution were fired. The path to that moment traced directly back to the night tea filled the harbor. It wasn't about destroying a shipment, it was about choosing principle over profit. That quiet act of defiance became the spark of a revolution. Revolution doesn't always announce itself with flags and fanfare. Sometimes it begins in silence, with a group of determined people standing firm in the cold, choosing courage over fear. In dumping the tea, the colonists weren't just rejecting a tax, they were rejecting an empire. And although the road ahead would be bitter and uncertain, one thing was undeniable. That night in Boston Harbor, a new chapter in history began. The colonies were no longer loyal subjects. They had become something entirely different, something disruptive. They were revolutionaries, and this was just the beginning. Long before the pyramids of Giza towered over the sands, before Mesopotamian cities bustled with life, before Stonehenge stood silhouetted against the sky, there was Caral. Hidden in the arid valleys of coastal Peru, Caral rose in quiet splendor nearly 5,000 years ago, only to disappear into obscurity, buried by time and forgotten by history. For centuries, the world had no idea it existed. The Supi Valley, where Caral once flourished, seems like an unlikely cradle of civilization. The terrain is dry and barren, and the river meanders through stone and dust like a fragile silver thread. To most, it looked lifeless, abandoned and inhospitable. But here, in this seemingly desolate place, one of humanity's earliest great cities emerged. Caral was far more than a loose gathering of shelters or a fleeting trading post. It was a planned city that spanned more than 150 acres, complete with pyramids, plazas, residential areas, and ceremonial grounds. It reflected scale, intention, and vision. This was a complex society that came into being centuries before the Egyptians built their own pyramids, and they accomplished all this without metal tools, without written language, and without the wheel. With only stone, earth, cooperation, and human determination, they constructed monumental architecture. Yet for thousands of years, Caral remained hidden from memory. Even those who stumbled upon the strange mounds scattered across the valley mistook them for natural hills, shaped by time and wind. No one guessed that beneath the dust lay one of the world's oldest cities, older even than those civilizations long considered the first. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists led by Ruth Shady uncovered the truth. What they found buried in the sands would reshape the history of the Americas and challenge our understanding of how civilization began. Caral had risen, thrived, and vanished without a trace. But now, after millennia of silence, its stones have begun to speak again, telling the story of a peaceful, sophisticated people who built a world of remarkable complexity in a place where survival seemed unlikely. And this was only the beginning. At first glance, the Soup Valley appears unwelcoming, its vast stretches of stone and sand battered by winds, scorched by a relentless sun. The land is cracked and dry. Water is scarce, the river barely clinging. To life, to an outsider, it looks like a desert abandoned by the gods. But the people of Caral saw something else. They didn't see a place to avoid, they saw potential. They recognized the river, small as it was, as the foundation for life. With creativity, effort, and vision, they transformed this barren landscape into a flourishing center of culture. Their first breakthrough was agriculture. They learned to manage the river's seasonal floods, building simple but effective irrigation systems to carry water across the valley floor. Where others saw only dust, they cultivated crops: cotton, beans, guava, squash, sweet potatoes. Cotton became especially valuable. It was woven into fishing nets and textiles, traded with coastal communities, and formed economic connections that extended well beyond their home. But farming was just one aspect of their success. The people of Corral understood that living in a desert required cooperation with nature. They built their homes and plazas from stone and earth, designed to handle both intense heat and occasional floods. They studied the skies, timing their harvests with the accuracy of expert astronomers. Trade was the lifeline of Corral. Cotton, dried fish, fruits, and handmade goods moved along the coast. In return, Corral received rare stones from the Andes, colorful shells from the Pacific, and even tropical fruits from far-off valleys. They were not isolated. They were part of a broad network of exchange. In a place where life seemed unlikely, Corral succeeded through intelligence, innovation, and unity. They didn't try to overpower the desert. They learned from it, worked with it, and built a society that was not only functional, but extraordinary. Against all odds, Corral thrived, and it was just beginning to rise. The pyramids of Corral rise from the earth like sentinels of the past, challenging everything we assumed about early civilizations in the Americas. These were not small, crude structures built by simple hands. They were large, intentional, and carefully designed. The city's centerpiece was the Pirámide Maya, the largest structure in Corral. It stretched over 450 feet in length and stood nearly 60 feet tall, an engineering feat comparable to the great wonders of the ancient world. Constructed from stone, mud, and woven reed bags filled with rocks, the pyramid was built to withstand the desert climate and the region's powerful earthquakes, and it endured, standing for nearly 5,000 years. But unlike Egypt's pyramids, Corrals were not tombs. They were places of ceremony, governance, and public life. At the top of their staircases were platforms where fires once burned, and rituals took place beneath the open sky. At the base of these structures, circular sunken plazas welcomed thousands, gathering for religious ceremonies, political discussions, and community events. The very layout of Corral suggests a people who valued unity and order, a community deeply connected to each other and the cosmos. Around the pyramids, residential complexes spread out, likely homes to priests, administrators, artisans, and farmers. The structures appear deliberately aligned with astronomical events, sunrises, solstices, and the movement of stars. To Corral's people, architecture was more than function. It was spiritual and cosmic. Even today, walking among the ancient, stones evokes a quiet awe. Built without the wheel, without metal, without draft animals, these structures still show symmetry, scale, and technical mastery. Corral's pyramids were not monuments to war or personal glory. They were built to unite heaven and earth, society and universe, humanity and eternity, and they continue to tell their story across the desert winds. There's something unique about Corral that sets it apart from most ancient civilizations. No weapons have been found here, no defensive walls surround its plazas. No evidence of war, mass death, or internal violence has been discovered. Unlike other empires that rose through conquest, Corral appears to have grown through peace. It's a revelation that challenges long-held assumptions. Here was a thriving civilization that focused not on domination, but on cooperation and shared culture. Rather than building fortresses, they built plazas. Instead of investing in armies, they invested in science, music, architecture, and religion. Their public spaces and pyramids weren't trophies of military victories. They were centers of ritual, celebration, and social life. Corral chose to trade rather than invade. Cotton, grown in fertile soils, was used to make nets, which were exchanged for coastal fish, a vital protein source. They also acquired exotic goods, colorful Pacific shells, Andean minerals, and tropical fruits from distant valleys. This vast, network of trade knit the region together, fostering mutual support and shared growth. And at the heart of it all, Corral thrived, serving as a cultural and economic anchor. Religious life played a central role in keeping the society united. The city's sunken plazas likely hosted ceremonies that reinforced a shared sense of purpose. Music echoed across these events, condor bone flutes, deer-hide drums, creating soundscapes that filled the desert air. Even leadership seems to have relied less on force and more on spiritual and civic roles. Coordinating monumental construction, managing crops and negotiating trade, this all happened without leaving behind the scars of violence. In a world often shaped by conflict, Corral stands as a remarkable exception. A reminder that civilization can be built not by conquest, but by collaboration, creativity, and mutual trust. At Corral, the stones still seem to resonate with echoes of an ancient world. This wasn't just a city of structures. It was a city of sound, ceremony, and meaning. Music and ritual were essential to its identity. Archaeologists uncovered a wealth of ancient instruments buried in the sand. Flutes carved from condor and pelican bones, whistles shaped from deer antlers, and drums stretched with animal hides. These weren't primitive toys. They were finely made, tuned instruments, crafted to carry sound across the city's wide plazas. In a society with no written language, music became a primary form of expression, a language of spirit and emotion. Imagine the D. Others believe shifting trade routes contributed. As neighboring societies expanded and new centers emerged along the coast and inland, Corral's economic role may have diminished. Perhaps their traditional exports, cotton, fish, produce, could no longer sustain dominance. Slowly, commerce dried up. There are also theories of internal decline. In the absence of written records, we can only speculate. Political tension, spiritual changes, or simply societal fatigue after centuries of growth. Even peaceful civilizations can falter when survival becomes uncertain. Whatever the reason, the decline appears to have been slow and steady. Families likely moved away gradually, seeking more fertile lands and stable rivers. Children who once played in Corral's plazas may have grown up hearing tales of a city now lost to time, stories that faded into legend. The desert reclaimed what had been built. Winds covered the temples with sand. Instruments and tools lay buried beneath the dunes. What was once a vibrant, thriving city became a landscape of quiet, sleeping mounds. For nearly 4,000 years, Corral lay forgotten, a faint murmur beneath the desert's breath. Travelers passed by the rounded hills, never imagining the remnants of a civilization older than Egypt's pyramids lay beneath their feet. These hills were seen as natural formations, shaped by wind and time. It wasn't until the late 20th century that Corral's silence was broken. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led an expedition into the Super Valley, guided by a growing belief that these hills concealed ancient secrets. What her team discovered changed history. Layer by layer, they brushed away the sand. Beneath it, they revealed stone walls, staircases, sunken plazas, and pyramids, a city far older than anyone expected. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the astonishing truth. Corral was over 4,600 years old, flourishing at the same time as Mesopotamia and early Egypt. This discovery reshaped our understanding of the Americas. Until Corral, it was believed that civilization here developed much later, under the shadow of the Old World empires. Corral overturned that assumption. It showed that the Americas had developed complex urban centers, monumental architecture, and social organization independently long before the rise of the Inca or Maya. Shady's team uncovered more than just ruins. They found musical instruments, fishing nets, textiles, quipu knot records, and religious offerings. Each artifact offered insight into a people who created a civilization driven by intelligence, artistry, and purpose. Corral's rediscovery wasn't merely an archaeological success, it was the rebirth of a forgotten world. A society that had lain dormant under the sand was once again open to the sky, touched by the same winds that once carried music and laughter through its streets. Today, Corral is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile but invaluable link to humanity's earliest dreams of community, creativity, and belief. The sands had hidden Corral well, but in the end, its stones remained, waiting to be seen, heard, and remembered. Corral endures as a silent giant, reminding us that the origins of civilization run far deeper than once believed. Among its plazas and pyramids, ancient stones still whisper a story, one that challenges old narratives. This is not a tale of conquest or bloodshed, but of harmony, innovation, and resilience. Long before the empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, the people of Corral were building something extraordinary. Without wheels, they raised pyramids. Without writing, they charted the stars. They created a society rooted in trade, music, ceremony, and engineering, without leaving behind scars of war. In an age often defined by violence, Corral offers a different vision, one where connection triumphs over domination and wisdom arises from harmony, not control. Corral reminds us that complexity doesn't require conflict. Greatness isn't measured by military might, but by the ability to build, create, and dream together. Its legacy extends far beyond the Supi Valley. It challenges the view that civilization had only one origin, that monumental cities belonged first to the old world. Corral shows that humanity's drive to innovate, connect, and transcend was universal, arising in many places shaped by many hands. Today, walking among Corral's weathered stones, one might still hear it. The soft beat of drums, the whisper of flutes, the voices of merchants, and the laughter of children under starlit skies. Their dreams, their lives, their spirit are not lost. They are etched into the very bones of the land. Corral teaches us that even when civilizations fall, their essence can persist, sleeping beneath the sands, waiting to be remembered, ready to inspire once more. In the vast story of humankind, Corral shines not just as a chapter of the past, but as a light for the future, a reminder that even in the driest deserts, under the weight of time, seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can rise and reach for the stars.